Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we're talking about what you can do when you're representing a buyer and the seller is not offering your full fee. Now, this is a delicate situation, and this is a challenging situation for a lot of us in real estate. And that's because historically, of course, we have the seller that's compensating the buyer's agent. And so oftentimes we never really even had to have too much of a conversation with buyers around how fee structures worked. However, that is a mistake, and that is what we're going to learn today. We're going to learn how do we go about preventing a situation like this where we have this uncomfortable conversation. And that's really the key, is how do we prevent this in the first place? And then secondly, if we are in this situation, how we can go about discussing this both with the selling side and the buyer side. So first off, as we know, there are three potential outcomes when we're representing a buyer and we're looking for compensation. Either the seller is going to compensate us, the buyer is going to compensate us, a combination of both, or we are not going to be compensated, or we're going to have a reduced compensation. So how can we prevent this, and how can we go about having this conversation? Well, first off, we have to prevent this uncomfortable conversation when it's too late. And that's why this conversation is uncomfortable. It's because we haven't necessarily brought it up beforehand. So in my buyer process, the way that I approach this is I have a section around how and why I get paid. Now, there's an order to this and there's a reason to the order. When I'm explaining compensation to the buyer, I want to follow this order. I want to follow the order of how I get paid, why I get paid, and then what happens if the seller is not paying my full compensation. So how and why do I have it in this order? Well, first off, I want to explain how I get paid. In most markets, the seller is compensating the buyer's agent. Now, across the world, that's not always the case. However, in North America and in some other markets, we tend to have this concept of the seller compensating the buyer's side. So I want to explain that to them. Now, here's the important thing when I'm explaining this first preventative measure is that I'm not letting them know that they are not paying my fee. I'm saying, in fact, there is a fee payable, and indirectly you are paying for it because it's made up as part of the purchase price, because the seller is paying a fee. And out of the purchase price, some of that will be fee structure, both to the listing side and the buyer side. So I explain that to them so they have an understanding of how I am getting paid. Next, we want to move into why we get paid. Now, this seems very basic, but we want to explain what we are doing in order to help them get the result that they're looking for. So our job is to help them make decisions. Our job is to help them understand the value of certain homes. Our job is to point out red flags. But ultimately, it's true, our job really comes down to assessing what they're looking for and helping them make a decision. That's really at the heart of what we're doing. Now, you will get into other reasons why somebody would want a buyer's agent in this case, but generally speaking, that is why we're getting paid. Finally, we then get into what happens if the seller is not compensating us. Now, the reason why this is so effective is because first we're explaining that the seller's paying the fee, then we're explaining why we're getting paid, and oftentimes they're nodding their head. They're saying, yeah, totally, I get it. I understand why I'm hiring a realtor. And then finally you get into, okay, well, this is what happens if the seller is not paying our fee. And that's where you get into the buyer agreement and how the buyer may be asked to make up the fee. But oftentimes what I'm doing at this point in time is I'm explaining the process of what I'm going to ask for. So this is market dependent, and you do have to be very mindful of what your current local rules and regulations are. But at this point in time, I'm having a discussion with the buyer and saying, if the seller is not paying the fee, then I simply ask the seller to make up the fee. That is step number one. And I ask them right at that point in time, do I have your permission to ask for the fee? And I will let you know, buyer, if the seller is not paying the full fee. And if that is the case, am I allowed to ask for it? Now, the reason why I ask for their permission is because they're going to nod their head, they're going to say yes. And if we come to this, then they've already preemptively been prepared for the fact that I'm going to ask the seller for the fee and they're going to know about it. So let's say the seller is not paying my fee. Then what do we do? And then I get into the fact that we may ask for the buyer, as in you, to make up some of the difference. However, it'll be on a case-by-case basis. And then I pause and I see what their reaction is. Because here is the thing, and here's what's at the heart of this. As you start working with a buyer, that buyer is going to want you to be compensated. As real estate agents, we think that our clients don't want us to be compensated, but they do because they want us to do a good job. And so at this point in time, I'm saying if we don't come to an agreement as far as the seller paying my fee, then I may ask for you, as in the buyer, to make up the fee. But we will discuss this beforehand. You won't be paying anything without knowing about it. Then finally, I will get into the fact if the buyer does not want representation, and if they want to go at it alone, so that's the wording that I'll tend to use. If a buyer or a seller for that matter is interested in going about doing the transaction on their own, I'll say you can go out on your own. So in that case, there won't be representation and there won't be compensation either. Now, next, what we're going to get into is what happens at that time. Maybe we haven't had this conversation, or maybe we even have had this conversation, but now the rubber meets the road and they want to write an offer on a property where our full fee is not being offered. What do we do? So the first thing to understand is, again, we have to be mindful of our local rules and regulations because everywhere could have a different stated rule as to how we can approach this. However, if you have a pretty standard market, and if this is allowed within your jurisdiction, then the first thing that I'm doing is I'm having the conversation with the buyer. I'm bringing up the fact that we already had this conversation. And if I didn't already have this conversation around how I get paid, why I get paid, and what happens if I'm not getting paid my full fee, then I would do it at this point in time. And then simply, I'm going to ask them if it's okay if I write it into the contract. Now, if this is allowed in your area, what this is going to do is when it's drafted into the contract versus me just calling up the listing agent and asking them verbally or texting or emailing, if it's actually in writing in the contract, the seller then has a hard decision to make. The seller has to make the decision of, do I want to work with this offer in front of me, even though I am paying the full fee structure to this buyer's agent, or do I want to let this deal go? Now, most sellers, especially in shifting markets, are going to want to work with the agent who's bringing the deal. Regardless of the fee, they want to sell their home. And oftentimes they're going to know if they are offering a lower fee. So they're not actually going to be overly surprised by you bringing an offer with a full fee. Now, the reason I like it written in there is because it takes it off the table in many respects. Because then when you start negotiating, oftentimes they're just going to negotiate on price. They're not even going to start negotiating on fee, because ultimately to a seller, what's most important is what's left in their pocket. It's not what the fee structure is. And so by drafting it in there, they can work on their math to make these numbers make sense for them. The seller has to make whatever decision's best for them. However, they have an offer in front of them. And so that's why writing it in is so effective. However, I've had this conversation with the buyers beforehand, so they're not confused by me drafting in this different sort of term in front of them. Okay, so what happens then if we've drafted it into the offer, seller sends it back to us, they've crossed it out and they've said, we're not paying you your full fee? Not going to happen. Well, now we're going to have a conversation. Now, the conversation that I tend to have with buyers at this point in time is quite simply around how the seller is viewing this. So if we are looking at a number of different comparables on the market, let's say we have 5 different comps on the market, and we are evaluating the value of this home, what we should be offering on this home based on comparables, as we probably do as agents. So here's the conversation I'm having with buyers, is if these 5 homes, these 5 comps all offered full commission, and this one is not, well, theoretically, the seller that you are writing an offer to is keeping more in their pocket than the remainder of these sellers. Now, as soon as you say that, the buyers are like, that doesn't seem fair. So all of these other ones paid the full commission, but this one's not, so they're keeping more. That's what you're telling me. And so because of that, that may change how they want to go about negotiations, right? Because they now have an understanding that the seller is pocketing more. And if the seller's pocketing more, they don't tend to love that concept. And then this bridges you so nicely into the concept of, okay, so if these comparables all included full commission, so now we're looking at our current subject property that's not offering full commission, what's the price we're going to offer? And then keeping in mind that the seller's offering X amount, so in order to make up the remainder of the commission, we have Y. And Y is what the buyer will have to pay us as part of the buyer representation agreement that we would have brought up at the start of the meeting. So with all of that being said, this is not an easy conversation, and I understand that. Asking a buyer to make up the difference is not an easy conversation. It's so much easier if we've had this conversation early. If we've gone through these preventative steps, they're already prepared for it. And then at this point in time, we can simply have a discussion with the buyer around what is fair. And oftentimes, we're just so scared of explaining, this is what we're getting paid and this is how it works. We shouldn't be scared of this. We're offering a service. So this is the fee for the service, and this is what the seller is offering. So here is the difference. Let's say the difference $5,000 or something like that the seller is then pocketing. So then I have a conversation with the buyer around this $5,000. How do we want to approach this? First off, more than happy to help you, and we can negotiate of that $5,000 what makes the most sense. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is in many cases, I'm actually not going to ask the buyer to make up the full $5,000. I'm going to ask the buyer to make up a portion of that. What I'm doing here is I'm preserving the relationship. I'm not asking them to make up the full amount, even though it will very likely be the majority of the amount. Let's say it's $5,000, I might ask them to make up $4,000. And then in that case, the buyer feels like we are doing them a favor, which we are, because we're reducing our fee in order to help them get this home. And so by reducing it slightly from the full amount, that then favors the buyer, you preserve the relationship, you still end up doing the deal, you're very likely to get referrals, and on top of that, you have a very, very happy buyer. Now, framing is important here. And what do I mean by framing? If I was just to say, you owe me $5,000, that's not going to go very well. But instead, when I've set it up to the fact that the seller is actually pocketing that $5,000, so maybe we want to offer $5,000 less, and then, hey, in order to make up my fee, you would pay an extra $4,000 versus $5,000, but hey, you're not paying that $5,000 when you're actually purchasing the home. From there, the logic starts to make sense for a buyer. Now, when I've had these conversations, I've always been nervous to bring them up. Straight up, I've been extremely nervous to bring this up because I'm fearful that the buyer is going to be like, oh, screw you, I don't want you to get paid. When in fact, the exact opposite happens. First off, they say, not fair to you. And second, they say, how can we ensure you get your full fee? And then this is where you'll really start to see the magic happen. They are advocating for you getting your whole fee. You are advocating for them, and you have this amazing relationship. So actually, out of these challenging situations, you can end up having these amazing relationships. And if you do have to make adjustments on your fee, don't just drop your fee and forget about it. You do want to comply with the buyer agreement, and you do want a fee to be made up. However, cut them a little slack. And by cutting them a slack, they feel like they're winning as well, because they are. And then everybody wins in these transactions. So to recap, when we are having this conversation, we want to be doing this preventative conversation up front when we're having our buyer meeting. If we have missed that, then at the time of writing the offer, we're explaining how we get paid, why we get paid, and then what happens if the seller is not offering our fee. You then move into writing it into the contract. If that doesn't work, although most of the time it does, but if it doesn't, and especially in a slower market, you'll find that it works a lot more because sellers are very happy to receive an offer. In slower markets, you'll find that they'll accept that a lot more frequently. But if they do cross it out, then you're having the conversation with the buyer. But I like to cut them a little bit of a deal because I want them to also feel like they're winning. And from there, you end up forming this fantastic relationship. You still get the majority, if not all, of your fee, and then everybody is happy. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out anytime on revrealestateschool.com, or I'm on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.